The other little piece we need to connect to this idea we are discussing of climate action as a global community is how do we decide who does what? There are rich countries, there are poor countries, but also there are countries who have emitted most of the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. Remember, we said carbon has a long residence time and it keeps accumulating. So if you look at the emissions since 1850 as a percentage of the world's total 1850 to 2011, you'll see that 27% is emitted by United States and some 25% by the European Union. China is down here, Russia, and then India can barely be seen, right? And 17% from the others. So if you wanted to attribute responsibilities for creating climate change, you would go with the rich countries. If you just wanted to go by history, then you would say the rich countries have emitted most of it. That's what is in the atmosphere, from 280 to 300 and whatever. But the appeal is that the countries didn't really know what they were doing. We were not fully aware that the emissions were going to be so bad. Of course, Arrhenius, as far back as 1800s, 70s, had already warned us, and Guy Callender and Eunice Foote have all had all already published that the carbon emissions are not good and it's going to lead to warming. Nonetheless, if you go just from 1990 onwards, you will see that the relative contributions of the United States and Europe fall off, and then China begins to dominate because it's become an economic giant that's growing really fast, and in the last few years it's been the biggest emitter. The COVID pandemic is going to change the calculations, but we are already back to normal economic activities, and you can see here India is beginning to grow as well. So this is part of the negotiation now, to not worry about historic emissions but just focus on what's happening since then. That still leaves us with this idea of how much we are consuming. So if you look at the per capita emissions in tons of carbon equivalent per capita. This is again from 2011, but numbers haven't changed too much. Canada is disproportionately high, US remains high, Russian Federation, and so on. And then China is at about 7 tons per person per year. India is at about 2 tons per person per year. These also hide a lot of information because China has lots of poor people who consume very less, and there are a lot of rich people who consume a lot at the level of the Western countries. The same goes for India. There's lots of poor people who consume very little and have basically very low carbon footprint, and the growing middle class continues to have larger and larger carbon footprint similar to the Western world. So averaging doesn't matter that much. But this also raises a question about population, right? So how do we account for population as a part of the climate problem? That's even more complicated because with this level of consumption, the total emission by India is obviously still much lower than these countries with much lower population. But on the other hand, the educated women continue to have fewer kids. Why? Because they want to give each kid a lot of resources, a lot of wealth, so that they can do well. And that means the per capita consumption goes up. So just because they have fewer kids and population goes down, fertility rates have been dropping already for several decades. It's a good news, but unless consumption also goes down, population is not going to compensate for the carbon footprint that we have because of high consumption. So you can see that this issue is very complicated, and we cannot simply worry about population as a cause of global change or not. We have to worry about per capita consumption and what the Earth's carrying capacity is. Because the other aspect of very low population is seen in countries like Norway, where the unemployment rates drop to such a low level that they don't even have people to clean the toilets. So when there is population, you have labor to do all levels of work. Is that a good thing? Well, somebody has to clean the toilet, so that also has to be considered in these calculations. So I have one more point to make about how sustainability should be thought of in terms of rich countries and poor countries, and we will see that in the next podcast.